Hello, my name is Reto Meyer.
And I'm Ian Nee Lewis.
We'll be looking at football apps and taking a deep dive into low latency, high efficiency data transfers, all in 30 minutes in this week's App Clinic. The most controversial aspect of this week's App Clinic is the name. Football? Soccer? Either way, we're talking about the world game.
That is the other world game that isn't baseball, American football, or cricket, which actually I think is probably, more worldly.
Well, certainly more worldly than any of the examples you gave.
I just want to make sure that we understand that Reto wrote the script for this, and when I hear football, I'm still thinking this.
Yeah, when he hears football, he thinks throwing a ball.
Exactly.
We're talking about a rectangular pitch, two 45-minute halves, and no hands except the hand of God.
Really? Is that what they say when they're doing soccer?
That's what I say when I'm doing soccer.
Nice. All right, to help us out this week, we have a new Bug Droid mascot, the extremely exclusive, uncanny Reto Meyer Doppelganger.
I had to do things to get this little guy. Things that I'm not comfortable talking about. But don't let that take away from enjoying the addition of our newest and most productive team member.
He just sits there.
Yeah. He's not making us go backwards, and that, my friend, is forward progress.
Now all we need to do is find a bug droid that's an uncanny resemblance to me, and we can put our early retirement plans into action.
Excellent. So this week we're talking football, or soccer. The only thing more fun than playing is watching, and the only thing more exciting than a game is tracking all the games. And that's what this week's apps are all about.
Why didn't we do this with beer? Is that a thing? Do you have beer with soccer?
I think that's a sporting thing, right? Sport and beer goes together like sport and beer.
Huh. All I had today was a Mountain Dew.
Well.
So here's a few of the things that we looked at with each app.
Any sports tracking app is going to live or die based on the depth and breadth of their coverage. If there's a team, player, or country that you want to follow and it isn't in the app, you're going to find another one that does include it.
So that breadth needs to be matched by depth. For every league, let's say I'm a fan, I want to be able to track all the games and the ladder and each player and their statistics, all the way down to live commentary, maybe some clips of fantastic plays, if your sport has them, and any other information that's going to make my enjoyment of the game more intense.
Yeah, and all that surface area means that navigation can become really important, as does the use of things like notifications and getting regular updates. So it's really easy to get lost if you start pivoting around teams and players and data and statistics. So you really need to be able to easily navigate around and find your way back out once you've dug in to as far as it can be.
Exactly, and that's especially important with this sport. I have to admit, I think there are more soccer teams in this world than grains of sand on all the oceans throughout time. But it applies to a lot of other things too. And so even if you're not into sport, I think that the things we'll be talking about today apply to anything where there's a large catalog of data that can be viewed in many different ways, and where you're likely to only be interested in a few pieces per user, but each user has their own favorite piece that they really want to get to, and would be pissed off if they couldn't get to it quickly.
Absolutely. And it's similarly with teams participating in lots of different leagues, playing several games a week, getting updates from all of these apps when a game starts or when your team scores is really important. But you've got to make sure that this doesn't come at the price of decreased battery life.
So today's fixture includes 3 apps. Wait, you wrote this, and then it says today's fixture. What is a fixture?
A fixture. A fixture is a schedule in the context of sport.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Today's
We're learning
fixture,
something every day on the App Clinic.
Right. So today's first down includes 3 apps. FUTMob, Game Plan, and Sporty. We'll take a look at each, then I'll spend the last 10 or 15 minutes diving deep into how these apps can ensure that you get your updates quickly, but without draining your battery.
Yeah, so let's get started with a look at FUTMob. Now, FUTMob recently released a brand new update that includes a bunch of beautiful new redesign elements, and that puts it a long way along the path of becoming pure Android.
Their experience starts off really well. It's got a great Google Play landing page that includes a fantastic banner and a perfect silhouette logo that could still be a little bit bigger. I think if we were going to feature these guys, we'd need that logo to be 2 to 3 times bigger than it is, just so it would show up. And I can say this with some authority because I am about 10 feet away from a monitor that is showing this logo at about 6 inches across, and I can't read it.
That's true, and in fact, you could pretty happily take up the full sort of side just behind Ian's head there.
Right,
you
exactly.
can't see the whole thing, but you've got that sort of A shape underneath the leg, and you could take up pretty much all of that space with the shield without it becoming obstructive.
It's a small quibble, but it ends up being very important for marketing your app on
and marketing is kind of a big play. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about with FOTMob are along the lines of these more nitpicky things. It is a really nice app, looks very professional, and they've gotten off on the right foot straight away here on the landing page. This looks like something that people have spent real money building, and that gives you that impression that it's going to be something worthwhile me downloading. So let's see who's going to be talking. It's going to be me. Excellent.
All right.
So once you get into the app, that feeling really continues. The overall layout is clean, it's uncluttered, and it does a good job of following the design guidelines. It definitely has the depth and breadth that we talked about and does a really good job of laying that all out in a fairly intuitive manner. They've used the view pager throughout the app really well to make the whole thing feel engaging, dynamic, and fluid, and they've integrated well with the platform. There's features like add to calendar for each of the fixtures so that you can basically use your existing notification techniques rather than having this app re-implement all of the things which are already built into the calendar app. So I really like that. Biggest area for improvements, they're relatively subtle and they're relatively nitpicky, so bear with me, but I think that if you consider some of these things, then we're really going to be able to consider this as a really example of the way that these sorts of apps can be made. Now, first off, they've introduced a couple of custom controls which aren't immediately obvious how they should be used. The first is this toggle at the top of each activity, which you can just about see, which says all. It's kind of in the middle up there. But without clicking it, there's no way to determine what it actually does. So if you click it, then it becomes clear that you have a choice between all matches or just the live matches. And they used a similar toggle throughout the app to do things like having the alerts turned off or on. But until you click it, you don't actually know what it controls. Now, you generally want to avoid this anti-pattern within your apps. And geeks like us, we're going to press everything on the screen just to see what it does in the hope that it does something cool. But most users treat their devices and computers a little differently. In fact, it's more common to find people who are worried that there's some magic button or key press combination that's going to delete all of their data and post nude photos of them on the internet. You don't want to confront folks like this with a mystery button anywhere in your UI.
You know, there's another issue with that particular button type, and that is that when you, there we go. When you have a button like this that's a toggle button and it has a label on it, there's a legitimate question as to whether the label represents the state that the button is currently in or the state that you will enter when you press that button.
Yeah.
So I think the right thing to do is have a toggle where you have both choices and you can go back and forth between them.
Exactly. You want to basically have it obvious what it does and obvious what the current state is. So similarly, there's a ladder button at the top right of each header, which seems like it should be, doesn't seem like it should be doing anything, and because it's too small. And so it's the same sort of thing that you'll see here. With above each game, there's a little header that tells you what league it's in, and there's a little button next to it which will allow you to view the standings in that league's ladder. The thing is that those touch targets are less than 40 dips square, which means they're really too small to hit with your finger, which if you're used to these sorts of apps, you're not expecting them to be touch targets because they're too small to be real touch targets. So you really want to make sure that all of these things are big enough to be able to be touched easily and to make it obvious when these things are touchable. Now, overall, I found the navigation pattern throughout the app a little bit confusing. In particular, the use of the up affordance. It often worked a lot more like a substitute back button than it did an up direction within the semantic hierarchy of the app. So it's a lot of words, but what I'm saying is, for example, if I navigate from this screen here within a match, and then from within the match go to look at a specific team, and then I press up, what I'm expecting to see then is something like a list of teams. But what actually happens is it takes me back to the previous match. Now that doesn't really make semantic sense in that hierarchy. Like team doesn't correspond to a single match, it corresponds to a bunch of maps or to a league. So you really want to sit down and spend a little bit of time just basically mapping out all of your activities and how they all correspond to each other in that more hierarchical fashion.
You know, a lot of people get back and up mixed up, and I think that the fact that the up button actually points to the left doesn't help things.
Yeah, it can be a little confusing.
But it's impossible to overstate the significance of it when you get into this type of app where there's a large catalog of data, because with this sort of large catalog, you want to be able to pivot your data in multiple directions. You want to be able to jump around, kind of like you do, on the World Wide Web or something. And just like on the World Wide Web on a web page, you have a single, let's say, golden hierarchy. That's the way the web page was sort of meant to be browsed, but then you have cross links everywhere so that you can get to what you're looking for quickly. The back button will take you back through your cross links very nicely, and that's essential Android behavior. But if you want to get up the hierarchy in some way, that's what the up affordance is for.
Absolutely. Final nitpick is if you have a look here, you can see that their draw implementation is slightly off based on what the design guidelines say you should be doing. What it should be doing is just sliding the content beneath the action bar in and out. The action bar itself should always be consistent and stationary along the entire top. So the only other thing I wanted to mention, navigating around the app the first time resulted in a lot of loading screens as I was swiping left and right, those sorts of things. Totally understandable. It might be worth trying to be a little more aggressive in your prefetching. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on how you can do that without being a battery drain a little bit later in today's show. Our next app is GamePlan. And they've got the right idea for their logo and banner, but both could do with a little bit of extra polish.
Yeah, I think that the sense that I get here is that they spent a great deal of money on an absolutely gorgeous picture, and then gave it to an intern with PowerPoint to put their logo on. I think that having something a little bit more distinctive for their logo would really help.
Yeah, exactly. That's generally the biggest challenge you're going to have when you take an app that you're going to start off building for yourself, because it does something that you want. And I think that's a fantastic reason to start building apps, because you want the app. And it's kind of what got me interested in smartphone development to begin with. It's like, wow, I can just build an app to do anything. The big challenge when you want to take that beyond yourself and your friends and turn it into something which has a real broad appeal and will get you a lot of downloads is that extra level of professionalism, that extra level of polish. And overall, that's probably the biggest advice that we've got for GamePlan overall. So as you can see, the initial view is really intimidating. It gives the impression of being either designed for an expert or for one individual, as well as lacking a certain amount of overall polish. It's not necessarily a problem, but it will discourage new or casual users from getting involved. And in this is an area it's probably the area with the most low-hanging fruit that you can harvest in the form of getting new users. And so to further that feeling, it's also using some non-standard UX mechanisms. So if you go to add a team, you do that by searching, and it will sort of start searching through the database and have a little modal dialog that says hit back if you want to stop searching, which makes sense, but is weird and confusing and just doesn't feel right.
Well, anytime you have to put text on your screen that says hit this button to do something, you've done it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. You want everything to be as intuitive as possible, to just feel normal, feel like it's the right way. And to further that feeling, there's also things like, that's really it. The risk here is that you're going to be giving people unfamiliar things, and they're going to find that intimidating. Once you get some data into the app, you can see that depth and breadth of coverage is there, which is a great start. So I really think that the next step for the developers here is to sit down and really think about a design that's really going to draw users in, something clean, something intuitive, easy to use. And I think that's probably the next step here before we go into too much detail there.
So the last app we're going to look at today is Spory.
It is. I love the banner. I hate the icon. It's a rounded rectangle with a gradient feel. Like, I'm looking at your banner and I'm seeing like real branding there. It's like strong colors, strong images, it's something very distinctive. And then I look at the logo and it's like, it's so sort of generic and boring. It's got the right colors,
What I wonder is, why haven't they used their football player silhouette in the icon? It would fit well, it would look nice, it would get you out of that whole rounded rectangle with the little shiny part.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that would be a really easy way, I think, to straight away make this landing page even more distinctive. And more than that, once the app is installed, but users have a lot of apps installed, right? You need to make your icon something which people are going to remember. And you can see that they've stuck a little football in here, which is almost a hint that, like, well, we used to have just the logo and no one knew what the hell it was. So we added the football, and so people have it.
But now it looks like you're part of the football network or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
It looks exactly.
It looks
it
like a badge.
Exactly right. So you're heading in the right direction, but keep going there, I think, is the big tip. I mean, this is nitpicky stuff, but from a lot of what we've been hearing from developers is they want to get more downloads, they want to have more successful merchandising, and it's these little nitpicky things which us as developers were like, come on, it's just an icon, who cares?
Well, and speaking of merchandising, remember the way that people bought your app was by looking at this banner. That's far and away the most important first impression they're going to get. And then once they download it, there's nothing about that banner that translates into the icon except for some subtleties of the color scheme, and it's not a very unusual color scheme. Yeah. So I don't think I'd be able to find it later on.
Exactly. You want to make sure people can find it after they've installed it, because a lot of people will do what we do on the App Clinic, which is download 3 or 4 apps which all supposedly do about the same thing, and then just go through each of them. If they can't even find it, then they don't have that association with the great experience that they started here.
Exactly. So let's move on.
Yeah.
So the app itself is great. There's functionality. There's has a lot of similarities with FUTMob. They've got a great, clean, and dynamic design that's clearly inspired by Holo. It does a great job of following our guidelines. So we're super happy about that, and we think they did a good job of layout. But in terms of feedback, it's not always obvious exactly what is going to be clickable on this screen. In fact, initially what we did was just sort of click nothing, and we just assumed that we were looking at a fairly shallow app that didn't have a lot of depth. To compound that, they've fallen into the same tiny touch targets trap that FUTMob had. So I don't know if they tested this on larger devices or they just have unnaturally small hands over in soccer watching countries.
It's possible. That's why we don't use our hands when we play soccer. Yeah.
Now I understand.
That
answers the whole question for me. So yeah, we need to make sure that the touch targets are a little larger, and there's also a lot of features. It almost feels like the problem here is that the app didn't want to add too many activities or too many screens, so they tried to cram everything into one screen, and then it became a little bit impenetrable as to what was active and what would do what. There's also a lot of features that are hidden away in the overflow menu. So it might be nice to move some of the more common features to the action bar, and maybe even hide some less commonly used features onto a different page entirely. To think about how people are going to use your app in the most general use case and try and program for that. But the biggest issue with the app is around navigation. And once you start digging in, it's so easy to lose your place. And just like we were talking about before, when you have a gigantic catalog of data, you need to be able to jump around, you need to be able to pivot, but you also need to find your way back to where you came. Otherwise, you're lost. Like, let's say Hansel and Gretel in the forest where they were left by their unkind stepmother. That's why most apps these days have, or most websites these days have something called breadcrumbs. And the up affordance is our version of that. We don't obviously have enough space to put an entire breadcrumb bar, but you should think about the up affordance that way. It's going to lead you back to the home page as quickly as possible. Now, I do want to highlight the great job they've done with updates and notifications. You can use these little plus icons that you see on the screen to track any game or team or player, and Sporty is going to give you notifications whenever whoever you're tracking starts playing or scores or anything important happens. That's an awesome feature. And they implemented it right. It doesn't drain your battery, which is by far the most important thing we can say about all of these apps is that they need to be implemented efficiently because they're transferring tremendous amounts of data that has real-time implications.
And if you can put the tablet up on screen, Daniel, we'll have a look here. Split panels here, so you can see that they've got the fixtures all on the left without having too much white space, and they've still got a nice view pager implementation, so you can scroll around and see what games are coming up. And then clicking on any of these fixtures is going to update the right-hand panel where you have all of your game information. And again, they've got a view pager. No, it's not a view pager. Interesting. So what you can see here is they've actually designed a great tablet version of the app. They've used the split panels here, so you can see that they've got the fixtures all on the left without having too much white space, and they've still got a nice view pager implementation, so you can scroll around and see what games are coming up. And then clicking on any of these fixtures is going to update the right-hand panel where you have all of your game information. And again, they've got a view pager. No, it's not a view pager. Interesting. Should be a view pager. So that should work the same way. It doesn't at the moment. You need to click each of the headings.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate because one of the things that I think is absolutely crucial with an app like this is to have animations everywhere because you need to understand which data you're leaving and which data is coming in. If it just kind of blinks on and off, it can be very easy to mentally lose your place.
Yeah, and so I wanted to highlight this because it's actually the only one of the 3 apps that we're looking at today which has a tablet implementation. And this is a really good example of a kind of app which would do well to have such an implementation because a lot of people are going to be sitting on their couch with their tablets in their hands, maybe watching sport on TV and browsing through fixtures, games, matches, players, standings, those sorts of things on their tablet. So as a content consumption device, tablets are awesome, and this is exactly the sort of app that you want to be able to have a more optimized design version for your tablet owners. So, how did they do it? How did these developers create apps which have all of this data, which gets updated really frequently, keep it all fresh, keep it all low latency without draining all the battery? So I'm going to spend the last few minutes of today's App Clinic doing a bit of a deep dive into low latency updates which still effectively use the battery. So where do you start off? So a good app is like a good butler, right? So you are going to want to have all of that data on screen as quickly as you can.
I love the fact that you have this slide. You've been using this slide for years, and yet it resonates with me not at all because I've never had a butler, good or otherwise.
You've never had a butler?
Closest I've ever come is Downton Abbey Marathon.
Nice. Well, that's my experience with a butler as well. But you know, right. So if you can squeeze that into a slightly smaller look on screen, there you go.
Oh yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So what we're saying here is that you want to have your information. You want to have it when you want it. You don't want to wait for it at all. And so what that translates into is that you need to figure out what that trade-off is between latency and battery life. So basically, you know, the less latency you have, the shorter battery life you have. And the reality is that trade-off, for most users, it wants to be here, right? You want to have maximum battery life, 0 latency, which is kind of a hard trick to pull off. But what that translates into for us as developers is you need to make a compromise. You need to make a decision about how are you going to do those downloads, when are you going to do those downloads. Now, it's obvious to say that you should transfer as little data as you can, as infrequently as you can. But for apps like this, that doesn't really work. You need the data. It needs to come, and there's lots of it. That's a big strength of the app. So you need to figure out how can you do it efficiently. Now, it turns out that the way that the mobile radio state works actually impacts how you need to make that decision. So the way it actually works is it'll be on standby mode, drawing as little battery current as possible. Then, as soon as someone or some app wants to download data, it's going to power up that radio. That takes a couple of seconds of latency. Then the radio is going to be on full power, transmitting, receiving, doing everything it needs to. And then when the last packet is sent, it's going to stop. It's going to say, well, we don't want to, if someone's browsing the web and they've just landed on a page, we don't want to have to cost them another 2 seconds every time they click a link. So we're going to wait somewhere around 5 to 10 seconds before we go into like a low battery mode. And then we're going to wait probably another 30 seconds or so before we go back into like the proper standby mode. So what does that tell us? Well, it means that if you've got fragmented network traffic like this, where you're doing little updates every 30 seconds and big data transfers whenever you need to, you're actually going to result in a really inefficient battery profile, where suddenly you've got the device staying on active for a huge amount of time, just because every 30 seconds it's powering it back up. It's basically never able to go back into full standby.
You know, one of the saddest things about this particular behavior is that something that, if you were on a desktop would make a huge amount of sense is horrible for a mobile environment, and that's going and checking to see if there's anything you need to download.
Exactly.
It's just as expensive in many cases to do an entire download as it is to just check and see if something is available.
Precisely. And so all of the things which we're going to be talking about now are ways in which you can make sure that all of your data transfers happen basically in one go. So you're already paying the price of bringing up the radio, getting the battery drain associated with that. Just do all of your transfers as much as you can. And so what that comes down to is doing things like prefetching. So if you're going to be downloading some data, download a bunch of data. It's going to be more efficient. Batch and bundle and preempt. So anytime you've got data which isn't, or a transfer which isn't particularly time sensitive, just batch it, just hold on, and then the next time you have something which is time sensitive, send it all in one go. This is particularly useful for things like ads, for analytics, anything like that, which isn't time sensitive.
You know, this is actually the hardest thing for a beginner to implement, but once you get into the habit of doing it this way, it becomes a beautiful way to implement your app. That all of the data that you're planning to transfer is kept in some sort of form on the disk of the device, on permanent storage, so that everything is always persisted. And that gives you not only better network behavior, but also better behavior in terms of being partially connected or having interruptions in your app or catastrophic failure recovery.
Absolutely. So I like to think of this as the big cookie model. So very small number of very big transfers. And some of the ways that you can implement this pattern, the first and the most simple and most powerful is what Ian was alluding to, which is using Google Cloud Messaging. So rather than having some sort of polling of like, oh, we're going to check every 5 minutes to see if there's something new, forget that. Do it all server-side. Have one server, multiple servers, checking all of your different sources of data. And when you've got something which a user has said, hey, I'm interested in all the Fulham games, they've marked that, they've told you that. As soon as you see something relevant, you ping them. You tell them specifically, hey, you should do an update now because there's been a change. This is much more efficient than doing polling yourself. You also want to do, and this we've sort of said this already, transfer as much as possible. Minimize the number of sessions, delay time-insensitive transfers, batching basically everything that you're doing. And prefetching, which is part of this. So try and download only what you'll need, but try and download everything you think you'll need. So that's really a balance where you're saying, figure people are going to use your app for the next 2 to 5 minutes and make sure that there's enough data there so that you're not going to have to do another poll, another connection to your service within that time frame, which means that if you're looking at one page on a view pager, you want to make sure you've got basically everything else horizontally along that strip and probably 2 swipes worth of vertical data as well. The cost for downloading that text data is going to be significantly smaller than the cost of having to spin up the radio in order to download that data later.
Yeah, at the very least, I mean, when you're talking about spinning up the radio for a certain number of seconds versus the amount of text that you're going to transfer over, let's say, a gzip compressed HTTP connection, you can actually get a lot of data within a fairly small number of packets.
Yeah, and you've got to keep in mind that by spinning up the radio, you're going to keep it on for somewhere between 10 seconds and a minute. So anything you can download in that amount of time is actually going to be more efficient than having to potentially download data that you don't need.
Yeah, you obviously don't want to download redundant data, but only because it's likely that the user will be charged for it.
Yes.
But you do want to download all of the new data you can. Usually if you have some sort of operational transform or time stamping or just anything that allows you to figure out what's new and what isn't and apply that to your local persistent storage, that's the best way to deal with an app like this.
Absolutely. While we're talking prefetching, it's worth noting that not all networks transfer data equally. So you can see here in this snippet of code, and all of these slides are going to be available, so much more easily readable than off the video. What we're doing here is simply saying, well, let's have a look at how fast this network is and download more data if we have a faster connection. And this is especially true not just because of the speed implications, but also because the faster networks tend to have a bigger battery drain. So it's even more important that you minimize the number of times that you're basically spinning up the radio to do another data transfer. If you can't use cloud-to-device messaging, if you just need to do regular polling for whatever reason, try and figure out a way that you don't need to use regular polling. But if you've done that and there really is no alternative, make sure that you use inexact repeating alarms. And this is a way of being able to set a regular polling alarm, which is going to allow you to synchronize all of those things at the same time. So that basically it's a way of letting the system do some batching for you. It's also worth trying to make sure that you're not using wake alarms if at all possible for this sort of thing, so that you're not draining the battery while the user isn't even using their phone. Similarly, if you are doing that sort of poll, it's worth considering this sort of inactivity back off, where if a user isn't using your app, they haven't opened it in 3 days, it's probably not as important to have that low latency data. So do keep track of how often the app is being used and consider modifying your refresh frequency based on their frequency of your app use. All of the details for this are available in this training class, transferring data without draining the battery. So all of the information I've shared quickly here is available in much more detail at that class. So our next step is to take a closer look at today's apps and see how close they are to being pure Android. So to do that, we're going to pass them through each of these checklists. So if you're the developer of FOTMob, Spory, or GamePlan, do get in touch, and me and Ian will try and provide you a little bit more detailed feedback on what your next steps should be if you want to make it to that next level.
Right, now we don't have a whole lot of time, but I do just want to point out for those of you watching from home that Reto, who wrote the script for this show, did in fact capitalize the M in me, thereby making this read sort of like the King James Bible. Just wanted to mention that. Let's move on.
So until then, you can find our existing Pure Android apps collection at bit.ly/pureandroid, and you can nominate your app for consideration by adding it to our Trello page at bit.ly/appclinictrello.
So we'll be back next week, hopefully, if neither one of us has the plague again.
Yeah, fingers
And
crossed.
don't forget to join Roman, Nick, and Adam on Android Design in Action next Tuesday.
Until next week, I'm Reto Meyer,
And I'm Ian Nee Lewis.
and this has been the App Clinic.